Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, December 23rd, 2023, and just weeks away from the Iowa caucus, we're going to be taking a look at a presidential election prediction between Governor Ron DeSantis from the state of Florida and President Joe Biden in the 2024 presidential election. Now, I just recently made a video between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, so of course, standard with this, we were going to do a Ron DeSantis-Joe Biden matchup around a week ago. And the reason I waited was because we have seen new data out of multiple states that suggests that Ron DeSantis is at an even weaker position when it comes down to Republican primary polling, Republican primary positioning going into the next election. Candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy has started to fade more into irrelevance as major organizations like CNN have started to opt in for just town halls with Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, and of course, a standing invite to President Trump at which he rejects in nearly every single instance. But regardless, we are starting to see a three-way race populate on the Republican side. So I decided to wait and decide to do this DeSantis video today. Now, to give you a bit of a precursor, Ron DeSantis initially came into this election season as an unbeatable candidate. He was someone who came from the 2022 midterms when he won in the state of Florida by a margin of 20 points across the ballot. And that was very significant, largely because Florida had been a state that Donald Trump only won in 2016 by 1 point and in 2020 by 3 points. And although Donald Trump did make improvements from 16 to 20, by 2022, there were considerations that Ron DeSantis might be in a competitive race. Even me personally, I believe that DeSantis was going to win by at most 10 points. He ended up winning by 19 on election day. And with this impressive feat, many people expected the 2024 election to be extremely lopsided in favor of Governor DeSantis should he make it that far. At that point in time, too, Donald Trump was being questioned about his ability to win over voters after losing numerous races for the GOP through proxy wars, meaning that there were many instances in which people were reconsidering, do we vote for Trump in 2024? Is he the right guy? And almost everybody turned to Governor DeSantis. But as people got to know him even more, people became much more astutely aware of his electability, or in some cases, unelectability. People became very worried about Ron DeSantis as a person. Was he personable? The answer in many instances was no. And so he faced a very, very difficult problem in the sense that voters simply didn't like him once they met him. They liked the idea of him, Florida's governor running the presidency, running for office, defeating President Trump, and ushering in a new sense of conservatism across the United States. But Ron DeSantis, by the end of it, simply was not that guy. And so knowing that, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party started to reevaluate whether or not Ron DeSantis really was this top-tier candidate. And as of right now, he simply is not. Let's take a look at where he is on the national data between him and President Biden, according to Real Clear Politics. Now, here's the new website, realclearpolling.com. This is not a sponsored ad or anything like that. It's just interesting because they released this brand new format. I don't think anybody knew it was coming along. So I'm interested to see what you guys think about this, but not to detract too heavily away, but this is just the new polling that's being released. But Ron DeSantis on average is ahead of President Biden by a margin of roughly 0.2%. It's a very close race. It's very, very competitive, but looking at the data between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, Ron DeSantis by far is the least impressive Republican on the 2024 ballot based on the general election performance. And the reason for that largely could be that the Republican Party simply isn't super impressed by Governor DeSantis anymore. Seeing him on the debate stage, seeing him on the ground in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, wherever it might be, Ron DeSantis does not strike anybody as somebody who can win a general election by a larger margin than Nikki Haley, and in many instances by a larger margin than Donald Trump. For a long period of time, we were sold on this promise that DeSantis, the amazing candidate from Florida, was going to translate that to general election victories across all of the battleground states. I kid you not. If you took every single battleground state from 2020 that Joe Biden won and swung it by as much as Florida swung between 2020 and 2022, it would be a red wave. I mean, looking at the states that were decided by very narrow margins, any improvement on Donald Trump, especially in a state like Florida, ideally would translate over into victories on other states. But that isn't the case. And that isn't the case because Ron DeSantis was perfect for Florida and horrible for the rest of the country. Now, the dire state of where we are on the Democratic Party side does tell us that Republicans absolutely do have a chance with Ron DeSantis. Anybody Republican who makes it by the end will have a chance. Even if it was somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy, he could still very well win the election. Presidential elections are almost always close, and this one absolutely will be. I do think that Donald Trump and Nikki Haley would win the presidency if the elections were held today. I'm not so sure about Ron DeSantis. We'll find out, obviously, by the end of the video, but I've wavered back and forth over the past week, figuring out, does DeSantis actually edge out Biden in the way that he supposedly thinks that he would? And just looking at the data in these swing states, there's a clear amount of voters who simply don't like DeSantis. I also think that we have to recognize the very real reality in which Biden facing up against DeSantis only happens if DeSantis takes down Donald Trump. I don't think that we're going to see any type of real disqualification on the ballots from the 14th Amendment. I don't think the RNC is going to step in and prevent Donald Trump from being the nominee. I think this would take some type of major change in Republican primary support that would allow DeSantis to come in with a strong GOP base while also defeating Donald Trump. But it also means there are voters out there that simply won't vote if Donald Trump isn't on the ballot. Voters out there that think if Donald Trump isn't running, why should I? If Donald Trump isn't running, why should I vote? And so that's what I think the Republican Party is afraid of happening. They have two different scenarios where Trump being on the ballot turns out Democrats who may have otherwise been staying home because of President Biden and their discomfort with him, but they could stomach somebody like Nikki Haley. On the flip side, if they nominate someone like Nikki Haley, the Trump voters won't turn out to vote. So very interesting. It's going to be very difficult to see, which one ends up being more factually correct, which one's stronger. By the end of it, of course, we're going to see probably a Biden v. Trump rematch, but this 2024 map is going to look very similar to the ones that we've seen thus far. Now, Ron DeSantis will likely win states like Florida by exceptional margins. I think he'd do better than Donald Trump, and he is popular across the state. I don't think he's lost his electability in Florida. Now, to the extent that I think it's going to be a safe state, I think presidential elections are a bit different. I don't think you're going to see a 20-point margin for Ron DeSantis. I could imagine a reality in which he wins a state like Florida by 15 points. I could also imagine it being narrowed down. For right now, I'm going to say Florida's safe red. I think I could be swayed very easily into a column other than that, but as of right now, I think if I was to call the shot, I would say Ron DeSantis wins here by 15 to 16 points. A reduction from the midterm margin, but still a huge display of support. Voters still very much like him in Florida. He's still popular across the state. Joe Biden, on the other hand, does win in a lot of the states that he was expected to against President Trump. Not necessarily by the same margins, but voters in New Hampshire really do not like Ron DeSantis. That's a problem that he has to combat. And, of course, Biden wins states like Colorado and New Mexico and Virginia, which he won by double digits in the last election. For a period of time, I thought Virginia would be a state that somebody like Ron DeSantis could win back. A more tempered conservative who reminds them more of Romney and McCain, but neither of them were able to do it either. I think Virginia, for right now, is a Biden state. Regardless of who's running, I think Nikki Haley can narrow it up. I think Trump could come within a similar margin as he did the last election. Virginia is a likely blue state. Colorado and New Mexico are still very much blue states. Look at the midterm elections. That's 16-point margin on the Senate level, 15 on the governor level, 14 on the presidential level in Colorado in 2020 and 2022. In New Mexico, Democrats did quite well here in 22. Did well, of course, in 2020 and 2018. And guess what? Hillary Clinton also won that state. So that brings Joe Biden to 213. New Hampshire, look at Ron DeSantis' data when it comes down to the primary there. The more that voters see him, both general election and primary alike, the less they like him. New Hampshire, in specific, too, is very big on personal freedoms. That's the state of individual liberty. You take a look at the Republican primary voting group there, they are pro-choice. Believe it or not, New Hampshire Republicans are more in favor of abortion being legal in most cases than they are against it being legal in most cases, unlike practically any other state. Without any type of strong conservative backing, Ron DeSantis doesn't do quite well. And I also think Donald Trump wouldn't necessarily either. But this video is not about Trump, so we're going to go back to DeSantis. He's at 195. Where are some states where he does well? Well, I think he still wins states like Iowa and Ohio. These are two states where the Democratic Party simply hasn't been able to crack, and even candidates that are as poor for the state as J.D. Vance have not been able to lose the state by a margin less than a likely margin. I also think Ron DeSantis would simply just win them over because these states have turned more conservative. You've seen an exodus of minority voters in areas like Cincinnati and Columbus that have gone down to the Sunbelt region, thus turning Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina bluer, but turning states like Ohio redder. It also doesn't help that rural voters are turning away from the Democratic Party even in elections where Donald Trump isn't on the ballot. I don't imagine this will be larger than 8 points, but I think we're hovering somewhere around there, and Ron DeSantis wins by around 6 to 7 in Ohio and Iowa. Still pretty impressive margins considering that Barack Obama won those states. Now, on the flip side of things, I don't think DeSantis is going to have this major crossover appeal to Hispanic voters as the way that we've seen argued just because of Florida. You know, Hispanic voters are not a monolith across the country, and I certainly don't think that swings that we saw in 2022 in states, in parts of the state like Miami-Dade and Broward County are going to exist elsewhere. I do think we will see some reversion in support amongst minority communities and an increase in support amongst white communities for Joe Biden. As was standard with 2020, I think we could see something similar again. But I think it'll balance itself out. I think we will find ourselves to be in states like Nevada, where you did see a drop in Hispanic support for the Democratic Party made up for by white voters in the state. And so that's something that I can imagine happening with Ron DeSantis, especially considering he's far from the all-inspirational candidate that both Donald Trump and, what's to some people's surprise, but it's true, Nikki Haley would provide for the GOP. So Nevada and Arizona, I think Joe Biden would win those states. I'm not saying that he's going to win them by very comfortable margins, but I imagine he wins them. I do think that the hype around DeSantis' ability to win over Hispanic and Latino voters is very much overhyped. I do not think it would translate into an actual result that is beneficial for the GOP, and I say this now confidently. I do believe Joe Biden would win Arizona and Nevada over Ron DeSantis even today with his level of unpopularity. And I also think, too, it helps that abortion is on the ballot in Arizona. There's a big reason why I'm more inclined to believe Arizona goes blue than some other states, and that's because voters will be voting on an issue that Democrats always win on, run on, and will do well on in the future. And so Arizona is one of those states where we say we're taking into consideration things external to the presidential election, and it's that abortion referendum that's set to hit the ballot. Now, in areas like Maine, I just characterized it as likely blue, very standard, but that's because Ron DeSantis is probably still going to win that second district. I think because Joe Biden is so unpopular right now, it's still likely red. I imagine, though, that if Joe Biden was to make some gains and he wasn't down 16 to 20 points nationwide and he was down maybe 8 to 10 even, which sounds crazy to say, but that's the way we've worked with these presidential approval ratings over the past 6 years, Maine would be potentially more towards the safe end, still likely because the second district will probably be voting red, but I can imagine it narrowing down. I don't think Joe Biden's going to lose the suburban regions, especially in areas like Nebraska second. I think it'll be closer than 2020. Joe Biden won that area by around 7 points in 2020, so I could see it shifting down towards the GOP, but not substantially enough that it flips the district black. So Nebraska second still is blue. The rest of the state, however, is quite red. So that leaves us around 86 toss-up electoral votes. Remember, 270 are needed to win. So a lot of what's going to be decided on election day is going to be determined by these, or what is going to be decided on election day will be determined by these very, very close and competitive states. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now, some more competitive than others. Minnesota, I think we can say at face value right now, is a lean blue state, hovering around a 4 to 5 point victory for Joe Biden. I do think Ron DeSantis does provide a stronger sense of normalcy for states that turned away heavily from President Trump. For instance, states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Ohio, Iowa did not shift away from Donald Trump. When you look at the difference in the presidential election, in fact, fortunately enough, this website, map.jacksonjude.com, link is right up here, by the way, if you're wondering what I've been using for things like this, but we actually have an amazing comparative feature that we can see the difference between elections. So 2000, let's see, compare sources, past elections versus past elections. 2012 through 2016, we see that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these states, Minnesota, Iowa, Ohio, all swung to the right in favor of Trump. But states like Arizona swung left. States like Texas swung left. States like Georgia swung left. I also just completely characterized Texas as a safe blue, as a safe red state. It's not going to be safe red. It's going to be likely meant to characterize that from the beginning. My apologies. I also think Alaska will be in that group. You're going to see South Carolina in that group. You're going to see a narrowing down across some of these states where it is a little bit closer, but again, not really consequential whatsoever. I apologize, though, for not doing that earlier on. But like I said, there were some very big reversions away from Trump. 6-point swing in Arizona. This is Hillary Clinton, by the way. We can use 2020 as a better point of reference. Georgia, 8 points for Biden. Arizona, 9 points for Biden. Texas, 10 points for Biden, right? You look at some of these states, clearly Trump was liked more than Romney in some, but in many cases, Romney was liked more in some of these battleground states. And so that makes it a little bit more difficult to see how, we can make an argument that somebody besides Trump would lose some of these states. That's why I think Arizona would be so close. That's why I have Georgia still in this toss-up column, because I'm still wondering, is there a situation in which DeSantis wins a state that Donald Trump wouldn't? And I think the answer is yes. And I also think Donald Trump would win many of these states as well. So Arizona right now goes in the toss-up, goes towards the Democratic Party. I do think, though, DeSantis wins a state like North Carolina. I think that's where we're going to see states start to revert back. DeSantis does well in the South as well. I also imagine that he would win a state like Georgia. Like I was saying, even though DeSantis isn't this all-inspiring, super likable candidate, Georgia is not necessarily a blue state. Republicans who have ran across this state who don't embody traditional and old conservatism, i.e. Herschel Walker, Kelly Loeffler, David Perdue, Donald Trump even, they lose, right? But candidates like Brian Kemp, and Ron DeSantis is no Brian Kemp, but he's closer. He's closer than Trump. He's closer than many other people. And I think Nikki Haley would do very well in a state like Georgia. Ron DeSantis, I think, could still win. Maybe it would narrow down to around a tilt margin. I could be swayed, and I honestly think that's a little bit better than a lean red state. I still think DeSantis wins the state. So right now, DeSantis wins 16 electoral votes out of the state of Georgia, leaving us with 44 toss-up electoral votes. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the big three that were a huge determining factor for Hillary Clinton. I think in this upcoming election, though, what we're going to see is Joe Biden wins a state like Michigan. He's also going to win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin by very narrow margins. I think that would be what we find on Election Day. That Ron DeSantis was able to narrow down many states, that DeSantis is able to flip Georgia. He comes very, very close in Arizona, very, very close in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but falls short. There's a reason he underperforms Donald Trump by 2 points nationally. He underperforms Nikki Haley 4 points, 5 points, 6 points in some cases nationally, and why he's doing so poorly in many of the states that have seen him more than President Trump is because he's not likable. He faces a huge, very dislikability problem that Donald Trump embraced in the 2016 election and was able to maneuver and work with. Ron DeSantis, unfortunately, has not been able to do that. And so I think in many instances where we see Biden doing a lot better against DeSantis than he does Trump, I think largely that is just because on the national front, people know and like Trump. They don't know and like DeSantis. Plenty of people who are at odds with the GOP may like Donald Trump because he's a businessman, because he brought a new type of wave to the American public. That's why he won in 2016. I think the Democratic Party often forgets that Donald Trump was a winning candidate before, and his message worked better than Romney's and McCain's, even if Democrats think Romney and McCain were more sensible and more reasonable for the average voter. To some people, he wasn't. And some people, that was the old way of doing things. This is the new way of doing things. I think DeSantis has that balance where in a redder situation or in a time where he was up maybe 4 points nationally, I would believe it, that he was able to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and Arizona and Nevada. But right now, I don't believe it. I think that he does better at winning back over Georgia, North Carolina. If there was no abortion referendum on the ballot in Arizona, I would also characterize it too as a red state. But there is, and that matters. And I think looking at this final map here, despite Joe Biden being very unpopular and Ron DeSantis still losing, is a testament that Ron DeSantis, who was once acclaimed as this super amazing, super strong, unbeatable candidate, has absolutely become the beatable one, if not the easiest one to beat for Democrats. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow.